Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. I'm very happy to be here with you and to introduce our next panel. As you can see, we've got a very talented team here. Our goal today is to further explore transatlantic cooperation. What does it mean to strengthen the U.S. commitment to Central Europe and to Europe as a whole? And yet, I don't believe that we can truly explore the potential for our collaboration without also understanding the era in which we live, and I'm talking about one of great power competition. Our panelists will speak both to the shifting role of NATO and the EU as a result of this great power competition, and how internal political division and external threats continue to reshape the competitive landscape. We hope that you'll touch upon the competition and how it may impact future foreign policy goals and explore the ways in which diplomacy, partnership can significantly serve and determine the path. I'd also like to just say personally, on a note of my own work, I think that the private sector has a very important role to play here. It can help unite different government stakeholders and amplify the tangible benefits of these close partnerships. I'm talking about economics, commercial activity, and as commercial activity develops, it bolsters diplomacy. We really need to go hand in hand with the private sector because we want to have transformational change. So I continue to believe we can work together with the private sector, and I urge us to think about that as well and its impact. So I'm very interested to hear about what our panel can do today. I'll introduce you very briefly. They need no introduction, but let me just say for those, we've got the Honorable Kurt Volker, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute here in Washington and the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and we hope you're very successful. Mr. Fred Kemp, our fearless leader and the President and CEO of the Atlantic Council and our host. And as you may know, before joining that council, Fred was with the Wall Street Journal for over 25 years. And finally, Ben Hadid, the new director of the Future Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Before joining the Atlantic Council, he was at the Hudson Institute, and he was an advisor to Mr. Macron. And he's also written a must-read book, Paradise Lost, Europe in the World of Trump. I think he makes a great case in that book about unity and the important challenges and threats ahead. So thank you for being here. We're going to talk for approximately 25 minutes of moderated discussion, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So with that, may I ask you the first question?
Sure.
Fred, you covered the rise of solidarity on the ground in Poland for Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal. And you also covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. How does what we're watching now compare?
Thank you, Sally, and you played your instrumental role during many of those times as well. First of all, nothing is inevitable and people make a difference. And I was in my office, I was working for Newsweek as a very young correspondent, and in the summer of 1980. In fall 1980. And my boss came in and said, I'm going to the Middle East. We've got Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat. It's peace in our time. It's going to change the face of history, the face of the Middle East. And I've got a cover story lined up. I'm going to interview both of them. And the chief of correspondence in New York, there seems to be some labor unrest in Poland, and would you mind seeing if you can get a visa and go out and take a look at that? And look where we are in the Middle East, and look where we are in Central and Eastern Europe. And it was life-changing for me to watch the rise of solidarity, to follow it over years, to go through martial law thinking all was lost, to meet with Lech Wałęsa after he's released from jail and have him talk to me about their times to plant potatoes, their times to reap potatoes, and we're planting potatoes now, and then they reap potatoes. And so having lived through that, I saw a country and people in a country that deeply believed in values and freedoms and a yearning for democracy that I had come to take for granted, and we had come to take for granted. And so, and I also saw the U.S. role, Ronald Reagan's role, others' role during that period of time, without which a lot of this could not have happened. So I won't rehearse that whole history, but as you know, I'm fond of the term inflection point. I do think we're at a defining moment of history. I compare it to 1919 and 1945, not because it's perfect, but because we have to remember as Americans what happens when we're not engaged, when we don't take action at historic moments. And I would say that's the period after World War I. And one should read the history of that time. People were enormously optimistic. It was the end of history. Democracy had won. Democracy was going to be the wave of the future. And within a couple of years, you had fascism in Italy and Germany, and you had what you had in Japan, and it was lost. We disengaged. League of Nations was a flop. We don't need to rehearse history, but that was bad. Post World War II, much better outcome. We engaged with our allies. We built new institutions, NATO, European Coal and Steel Community, and so forth and so on. As far as I'm concerned, that's all at risk now. And Central and Eastern Europe is really the place where we need to consolidate what we were able to create after the fall of the Berlin Wall and through 1945. And we have to realize that this is going to be really, if you're looking at tectonic plates, this is going to be a crucial place where we have to make sure that the institutions we've created stick, that the democracies that were emerging continue to evolve. And so this feels this feels as historic as those previous times. And at the heart of it is great power competition, which we're going to be talking about. But let's not forget the other two powers aren't democracies. So it's also a new form of authoritarianism, authoritarian capitalism, that works a lot better than the Soviet system worked. It's a fiercer and stronger peer competitor in the technology world and the economy world. So I don't want to go on too much. I don't want to go on any longer right now, but it feels as historic as those moments, but with a stronger peer competitor. And remember how fearful we were of the Soviet Union and what they might do in Poland in those days, which they ended up not doing. But this is as much an economic battle, more of an economic battle, more of an economic competition battle than a security issue.
With that answer, I think we should all be very happy that GLOBSEC and the Atlantic Council are talking about it, because this is the way to get to the solution. So thank you for that. Kurt, there's a lot of talk about weakness inside NATO. There are Central European colleagues here. Some have been criticized, one country particularly. In light of this, where do you see the weakest link in NATO?
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Fred, and Ratso and others for inviting me and putting this together. Answer your question in a very short bite is the biggest problem confronting NATO right now is the lack of a U.S.-German partnership. That if the United States and Germany were able to sit down and figure out what we're trying to do together, and that's at a broad level, so security, but also economics, also trade, also dealing with China, not strictly confined to the NATO normal business, I think a lot of things would be going in the right direction. But the fact that we have a almost, I won't say hostile, but certainly a negative dynamic to U.S.-German dialogue right now is hurting everything. Now let me take that and broaden out that point a little bit. When you look around the strategic competition, and Fred was mentioning China, Russia, of course we have terrorists, of course we have North Korea and Iran and so forth, but the U.S. and the transatlantic community go into that competition with almost all of the cards in our hand. We've got the best economy, we have the best military, we have values that make our society sustainable. People can change governments, people believe in them, we can inspire people around the world, we have genuine allies around the world. So we go into this with tremendous strength. And the only thing that's really a threat to our transatlantic community or to the advance of these values in the world is ourselves. That we are not pulling ourselves together and doing our job. of making sure our societies, our political systems are successful. And I think if we can get back on track with that, and it'll take time in this country, it'll take time in Europe, get back on track with that, everything else is in good shape.
We're playing a weak hand, strong hand weakly. Right.
And, you know, as people often say, and I think it is very true, President Putin plays a weak hand very well. We should see that if we have vision and patience, and we can position, the weight of things will advance freedom, democracy, rule of law, open economies in that direction over time. That's been the long course of human history, has been the opening up of all that, and it's going to continue.
Thank you. Ben, you've made the case in a book for Europeans to reconcile themselves with power politics. Is that a possibility?
No, Fred was referencing earlier the end of history, and no other power more than the European Union has built its very identity on the premise of the end of history. Transcending power politics, replacing conflict, territorial conflicts, borders, nationalism, identity with technical cooperation, bureaucrats, lawyers, economists. On the one hand, it's one of the greatest political success in world history. What has happened, these 70 years of prosperity and peace on the European continent that followed 70 years of basically civil war on the European continent. But it doesn't set well Europeans for the world that prepares, which is a world in which they are surrounded by an arc of crisis on their southern and eastern periphery, with migration, terrorism, to revisionist power, obviously Russia, but also China. They're trying to divide them, they're trying to expand their spheres of influence. Remember, this is one of the root causes of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. Europeans, on the one hand, were negotiating a DCFTA, a free trade association agreement, with Ukrainians having a very economic approach to it, while for Ukrainians, it was a political agreement. It was a way to anchor Ukraine to a world of liberal democracy, push back against the corruption of their leaders, get close to Europe. This is something that European leaders completely missed in the conversation. They were completely unprepared to what happened. We see a similar reaction to China right now. When China invests in your economy, setting up the 16+1 in Central and Eastern Europe and the Belt and Road Initiative, as Phil Rieker said earlier, this is not only about profit and economics. You're dealing with a country that's leveraging these investments for political influence. That doesn't mean that the European Union and Europeans should shut themselves off from foreign investment, but at least they should realize this. Now, I'm optimistic for a few reasons. The first one is I do think that this is where Central and Eastern European states can play a very constructive and positive role within the European Union, because they can bring, let's say, a sense of the tragic of history. They have a very different relationship to NATO and to the European Union, because they see them as protecting their identity, their sovereignty, their sense of nation. And so I think you can have this convergence, like compromise between old European nations, Western countries like France and Germany, and countries like Poland, for example, that take issues of hard security and hard power seriously. And another reason why I'm cautiously optimistic on this is because there is, I think, a general awakening to power politics and security issues on the European continent. It's linked to the migration crisis, linked to Russian aggression on Ukraine. You see a general increase in defense spending all over the continent over the last few years. See instruments like PESCO, the European Defense Fund, that are trying to also bolster a European industrial base, which I think is a positive thing. You see the European Commission, and we'll talk about it, I think, a little bit more, taking seriously the challenge of China. There was a paper from the European Commission a couple months ago calling China a systemic rival. We had Florence Parly, the French defense minister, here a couple months ago, referring to China as a threat twice, and France and the United Kingdom are conducting freedom of operation navigation in the freedom of navigation operation in South China Sea. So there is this sort of, it's too slow because it's a burdensome decision-making process, because there are divisions over priorities, but I think there's lots of good news that people are not talking about enough. And I think another reason why it's happening is also because the message from Washington is clear and it needs to be heard, which is two presidents, one Democrat, one Republican in a row, making the case for more burden sharing. and for Europeans stepping up on this. And I think this is a message that Europeans should listen to, and they should not making it about this current president or his personality quirk, but understand that this is a broader concern that U.S. policymakers share abroad the political spectrum.
Well, I like your optimism, so I'm going to go with you on that one. Fred, let me ask you as well. China's been reaching out through the 16+1 format in the region. How does that challenge compare to that of the Soviet Union a generation ago?
I think ultimately history will show it's a bigger challenge, and it could result in a more lasting geopolitical shift. Within 5 years, the combined GDP of what the Freedom House refers to as non-free countries will exceed that of democracies for the first time in 100 years. One also shouldn't forget that in 1776, we just had July 4th, there was essentially no democracy. We'd had, after it was created in 508 BC in Athens, there was a 2,000-year dormancy. And then 1941, there were 11. 1993 was a high point where for the first time in human history, a majority of countries of over 1 million population were democracies. And we've had a recession of democratic freedoms since for 13 years. So there's nothing inevitable about all of this going on. And China there's some assumption that it would evolve over time, become more democratic, become more of a partner with the United States and the world stage in terms of the global commons. Possible. China is also more invested in the globalization, the global system, than the Soviet Union ever was. They have more to lose, as we see now in the technology showdown in Huawei, so you see some options there. But also, if we put countries in a position where they have to choose between us, very often those countries have the US and China as their number 1 and number 2 trading partners, and I'm not sure we'll always like the answer that we get. And so we have to think that one through. So I think it's a generational struggle. This is going to go 30, 40 years. It's really interesting to watch it in Central and Eastern Europe, because I think Europe could take one of 3 approaches toward China. One of them is a unified policy of Europe toward China that is aware of the dangers but manages them and deals as a bloc together with China, and so you have more leverage in the negotiations. I don't see that happening right now. Even though you had a recent European Commission report calling it a systemic rival. So it's possible, but it doesn't look likely. The other is a divided Europe, ad hoc, seeing who can get the most value, a port here, or an infrastructure project there. And don't forget, we criticize China saying, well, they don't have an alliance and we have an alliance. For them, these infrastructure projects create allies. Now, their economic allies are different allies than we have, but they're still strong allies. So one of them is a unified approach, the other is divided approach, the other is all in for China, because they see the economic benefits there over time are going to be greater than with the US. And I must say, when you're talking about the problems with US and Germany, I think the Germans, because of their manufacturing, because of the cars they're selling in China, because of their economic interests, I think that's one to watch really closely. And Germany and Poland are not on the same page in how to manage this relationship. So if I look at it, I think it's actually a bigger test. And again, part of it is, are we going to be all in? You've talked about this before, Kurt, where you say it's a major power struggle, where the other two may be more all in than we are at this moment, and more cognizant of the challenges.
Took the words out of my mouth.
Yeah.
If I can just follow on that, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Is that when you give these statistics about the economy in the world and the majority being non-democratic, China skews the statistics. If China is like one big thing. Yeah. If you leave China out of that, there's a lot to be encouraged about as the movement of people in the world. Look at Hong Kong, look at the new president of Slovakia, look at the president of Ukraine, look at Armenia. Even these transformations going on in Georgia right now are kind of interesting about where that's going to take Georgia going down in the future. Venezuela, it'll get there. I'm optimistic. I think people are actually still rising to the challenge all over the world, that they are demanding their rights and their freedoms in societies. China's not, but then let's take another look at China too. The problem we have with Russia is that it is a government that doesn't care about its own people. It is about power and money for the Kremlin and the ruling class, and that's it. And it's very abusive. China fundamentally disagrees with us on human rights, democracy, individual freedoms. However, they do care about lifting people out of poverty. They care about technological advancement. They care about stability in the neighborhood. They don't want to be in wars. They care about health. They care about the environment. Increasingly, they care about fighting corruption. There's a lot that we in China would find that we have in common, leaving aside the fundamental freedoms and democracy issues. And China has been in a period of rapid change over the last 50 years. I think China is going to continue to change, and I think if I had to separate out, what do you do as the United States in these things? First off, get all in, as you said, have a proactive vision of trying to build a world that is conducive to freedom, democracy, rule of law, so forth. But we should also be seeking to block Russia. Russia's going to decline over time, but engage China. Because I think China, there is still room where China's not going away. We are going to have to live together. We're going to have a lot of interests in common, even though we have differences, and I think that's ripe for engagement.
That's actually really interesting, because for many, many years, I think people felt that the West and Russia would get together to fight China. And so you're really arguing something quite different today. Interesting.
Strategically, I'm not sure in my lifetime I've seen China and Russia as close as they are today. And a lot of that is the relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin. A lot of that is that Russia seems to have come to terms with the fact that they're the junior partner, certainly in economic terms. A lot of that is the U.S. as a foil. But I think this is something to watch closely. I think everyone has said, well, it's fragile and there's historical resentments and this could all fall apart. Maybe, but I think we can't continue to act on our wishful thinking or assumptions. I think we have to act on where the situation is now.
We need to pull ourselves together.
Yep.
As someone who worked with many of you and working with the NATO allies to get the last 10 countries in, I was disappointed, frankly, when the Visegrad 4 got in, and I felt that they could have been much more helpful to those that were coming after them. And I raise this with you, Kurt, because what should NATO and the Visegrad do with Georgia and Ukrainian aspirations?
Thank you. Wonderful. It's teeing up that question. So I'm looking around and I see Karin and I see Carl and I see Mike, I see the Ukrainians. So we have people in this country, Central European ethnic voters, who worked together to help advance Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia joining NATO back in the 1990s. Those same voters, those same people should care about the fate of Ukraine or care about the fate of Georgia and make their voices heard in our electoral process as they did in the 1990s and 2000s. I just think that's an important thing. Now, another way to come at this is, let's take specifically the case of Georgia. Here you have a country that has had democratic transition of power. They've had reasonably successful elections, leaving aside the recent the presidential election that was flawed. They have the opportunity now, a year out, for another parliamentary election. They've just moved to proportional representation. If Georgia keeps getting it right, and that's an if, they have to do it. They have to make sure they take advantage of this opportunity. Pretty soon we're going to be faced with the only obstacle to Georgia advancing in its relationship with NATO to be Russia occupying Abkhazia and South Ossetia. If that's the only reason, that's a really bad reason, because we shouldn't be comfortable in a situation where people in Tallinn or Bratislava or Berlin are safe and people in Tbilisi and Kiev are not. What's the difference? Everyone is aspiring to the same things. We did this as NATO when it was hard, when it was dangerous. Ed wrote a book about the Berlin airlift. We did that. And we shouldn't think that, well, we can't do it because it's hard now. We should still care about the same values and trying to really unify a Europe around those values, and ultimately hope to see Russia included in that as well, but that's going to take a bigger transformation in Russia.
As someone who was there, it seemed really hard.
Yeah.
So it's not any less hard.
Right.
And that's not why we don't do it.
That's right. So we should keep the vision out there. We should have high expectations of what Ukraine or Georgia or others will deliver, but we should also be prepared to be inclusive in thinking about what kind of Europe we're building.
Great, thanks. Ben, what is the role of the EU in a world of competing great powers, and how do the countries of the Visegrad Four fit in?
I mean, that's a question for Europeans to reconcile themselves with, but they don't have much of a choice than to emerge as a political power. And I do think Europeans already have a lot of instruments, because we talk about raising defense spending and investing in security, but the European Union, when you think about China, the European Union is already a great asset when you consider that the Chinese challenge today is not only or not even primarily military. It's not only about the South China Sea. It's about what kind of globalization do we want, what kind of norms for trade, for artificial intelligence and privacy, for data collection. And in this, the boring, slow decision-making process of the EU bureaucracy can be extraordinarily effective. When you look at the impact that the EU regulatory power had on breaking the Gazprom monopolies on energy in Europe, this is one of the unsung success stories of the last few years, how Europe, thanks to the Commission, has increased its energy independence toward Russia. It's an incredible power when it comes to trade agreements. Here again, it takes a long time, but it manages to impose its trade rules. I find it actually really interesting to see that just in how much the conversation has shifted on China over the last couple of years in both the United States and Europe in the same direction. You have the same concerns over technology theft, spying, disguised subsidies in the European capital. You have the French and the Germans that are starting to put up investment screening schemes, the same thing with the European Commission, and yet we're not able transatlantically to get our act together and to really integrate Europeans into the conversation that's happening right now in the United States over China. And instead, I think we're going for a much more unilateral, let's say bilateral Washington to Beijing approach. And the European Union in this respect can be an amazing asset for US foreign policy when it thinks of China.
I want to comment on that. Ben and I haven't talked about this, but I've read you closely on the issue of strategic autonomy. The U.S. doesn't have strategic autonomy. The European Union certainly is not going to achieve it. And I think to push in that direction is going to divide Europe, because I think the Nordics and the Central and East Europeans are looking at this and saying, you know, if I really get into trouble, there's questions about the U.S. and what the U.S. is going to do. I think in their minds there may be more questions whether the French and Germans are going to come give them Article 5 defense. But let me say another thing, which is there are two pillars to U.S. strategy toward Europe. There are many pillars, but the EU is one of them, and NATO is the other one. And we have to, let's stop trade fights. Let's not get in a fight over Airbus, Boeing. Let's come to a truce. Let's settle this. Let's not go down the road of auto tariffs and all that. We can negotiate all of this, but not just negotiate away our problems. Let's negotiate our way to, I don't know if it's son or daughter of TTIP, but this still is the most important economic space on earth. And we don't have economic autonomy, we don't have strategic autonomy. We have to work as a transatlantic community with all of our problems to really double down in our cohesiveness. I know that's hard to say right now with the current emotions and spats that are taking on, but we just, if we're talking about a new era of global power competition, it is the democratic world in a contest for what we thought was decided after 1989, 1990, but wasn't.
But clearly, I think in this struggle, the United States has a stake in having a strong and united European Union. I mean, I'll give you an example. Britain is the first country right now that turns to Huawei to give 5G licenses. It's obvious there's a connection with Brexit. It's obvious that now that the United Kingdom chooses to leave the European Union, it's looking for other partners. This is what global Britain looks like. And it's interesting to see that some of the same people who think that China is a challenge to the United States have been sometimes supporting Brexit, thinking that this could somehow, push American interest in the region. Of course not. And so I think that the debate about strategic autonomy is sometimes a little skewed because of some of the partisans of that notion in Europe. It sort of goes in every direction, but the idea that Europeans at least should be able to defend their own interests, to have their own security means, to sometimes intervene on their own, especially with, not against US interests, but when the United States is pulling off of regions like North Africa, the Middle East. I mean, I think a good example is the US-French cooperation in the Sahel, where the French, with now the backing of Europeans, you have Estonian troops, German troops, are fighting Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in the Sahel. And you have US support with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, financial resources as well. So that's an operation that was conducted autonomously by the French and then by Europeans that completely fit into a broader transatlantic strategic interest. But when it comes to great power competition like Russia and China, it's absolutely clear that we need to keep unity and that a lot of the sometimes legitimate grievances over trade barriers are such a distraction when compared to the broader challenges that we face together. And I think once again, and we agree, having the largest integrated single market in the world, one of the biggest norm setter in the world on your side is obviously a huge asset when you face this challenge.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to Q&A. Whoever has a question, and please give your name and affiliation. Ian.
Thank you. Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. Since this is a conversation on great power competition, I'd be interested in knowing what our panelists think is the most likely upcoming or approaching possible crisis between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia, be it a financial clash, be it a sort of a territorial aggression by either Russia and China. And how do you think the Europeans will fall on this? Will they fall behind the United States? Will they look at their shoes? Will Europe be split between New Europe and Old Europe?
Who would like to take that upbeat question?
I'll take a crack at it, but I'd like to hear everybody's views. I think with Russia, the only real danger, or the most likely danger, is an accidental military encounter. The Russians have been acting very provocatively militarily in the Bering Sea, in the north, in Europe, even in Syria, and where we have forces in the same zone. And an accidental confrontation with Russia, I think, is possible. And that would be terrible, because then it's really difficult to make sure you don't escalate or anything. Russia is going to continue to manipulate and press its neighborhood. And that's one where I think we need steady pushback, but I don't see that leading to a US-Russia conflict per se. On China, I think we're already kind of seeing it. we're seeing a effort on the part of the administration to really push hard on China on trade issues in order to try to get a better deal from China. And China is going right back at it and saying, nope, we're going to do it our way. I think both sides are thinking they have more running room, and the other side is going to have to back down. And I think we are going to see that continued pressure and standoff with China on trade and the things around trade, technology, intellectual property, and so forth. Not going to change anytime soon.
I agree with you that it's Russia, but the question about will the Europeans be there? Will they step up?
Well, I see some Estonian friends here too, and I'm always reminded of the Estonian joke that, how can you tell an Estonian extrovert is because they look at your shoes. And I do think that, I think Europe is going to do its best to just say, off ramps, de-escalate, don't let anything happen, and just stay out of it, unfortunately, if there is any kind of confrontation.
So I'm going to give my quick answer. So I have a couple of very close Chinese friends. I have a lot of Chinese friends, but I have a couple of friends who play a lot of Go. Now, I haven't played Go, but I'm told Go is all about avoiding conflict. You who play it, you would know that. I think the Chinese will continue to do that, and the danger with the Chinese is, which I think we're already seeing in places like Africa and Latin America and various other parts of the world, is we lose because we're not there, and there was no conflict. It just happened, and maybe it's not a zero-sum game, but on some issues, I think that the Chinese are starting to think a little bit more, partly because of where we are in our conflict. With the Russians, I think there's more of a danger of miscalculation. And I actually believe that if that happens, there's a very good chance Europe would be with us. Would it be all countries of Europe? It depends on the situation. It depends how it happens. But I'm more worried about a declining nuclear power is, to me, more dangerous than a rising economic power that wants to avoid conflict in the immediate term. The other is I think Damon's talked about this before. It's Russia's trying to disrupt, and China's trying to displace. And displacement happens over time, over a long period of time, maybe without conflict. Disrupt, you never know what could happen that you're not expecting. And we've been surprised in Crimea, we're surprised in Georgia, we were surprised in Syria. Do we really, I mean, it would be naive to think we're not going to be surprised again.
Ben, do you want to add?
I want to continue with the metaphor for Go, because I think clearly with China, I'm less worried about a crisis. Then there's just steady progressive encroachment in, for example, in European periphery. I mean, you look at Central Asia and the Balkans. We hosted Commissioner Hahn, who's the Commissioner for Enlargement, the European Union, recently, and he told us very bluntly, we underestimate China's influence in the Balkans. And this is the very periphery. You have the United States is involved, Russia a little bit, but declining power, and now China is getting in with infrastructure investment. Europeans are nowhere to be seen. In Central Asia, it's exactly the same thing. And actually, the United States is not as involved in Central Asia. I was reading a piece this morning. In Kyrgyzstan, the average income per capita is $1,000 per person. The average person also owns a debt of $730 to China because of all the Chinese money that's pouring in infrastructure, road building, etc. And Kyrgyzstan is not even the main one. It's Kazakhstan. So, and in Go, you don't have any absolute victories. You only have relative victories, and you progressively encircle your opponents. So Kissinger says, actually, in his book on China. So that's what I'm in. In a way, there's not going to be the Sputnik haha moment on China that's going to awaken us. It's progressive, and that was what worries me a little bit, especially in terms of especially in terms of mobilizing public opinion. I think that's going to be one of the challenges on both sides of the Atlantic.
One sentence on it. So Steve Hadley, who's our executive vice chair and head strategy on our board, says everything will be all right with China if we can figure out how to be strategic collaborators and strategic competitors simultaneously. The only problem is it's never happened before. and so that is the challenge, and it is possible if you have diplomats at a really high level and you really think strategically about where we're going. And the danger with China is that's not what we're doing. And so we're not communicating to actually navigate this relationship into a place. Neither one of our countries is going anywhere. Neither one of our systems, I don't think, maybe some people think, but I don't think is going anywhere. And so we really have to get to this strategic collaborator, strategic cooperator, competitor mode.
Please.
Jeff Stacey, one of the Hillary Clinton campaign folks who had to find a new line of work recently. You gentlemen, important thinkers and doers, could I ask you about a scenario in which the U.S. may not show up, that may not be accidental? Montenegro, for example, is something that President Trump spoke about not too long ago. And he stirred up a hornet's nest in the process, and we were all sort of fearing. I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy about it. Could Russia target Montenegro, and all of a sudden the U.S. doesn't respond, and Article 5 falls apart? Do we have legitimate fears like that still? What do we do about them? Where does this go from here?
Who would like to?
I'll do 30 seconds and then others can. I think we have to quit thinking in conventional categories. That there's going to be some sort of Article 5 offense in Montenegro or Estonia and we won't respond. That's just not the way it's going to happen. And the problem is hybrid threats are really confounding, because they can be the purchase of a political party. They can be a corruption of a system. They can be, certainly cyber and different activities like that. They can be ways of swinging election through what we know in terms of disinformation. But it doesn't have to be disinformation if you actually have influence inside a party. And so I think the thing that's hard about this is it's not going to happen that way. And it's right to ask, would the U.S. be there, would not be there? I just don't think it's going to happen that way. So what we have to do is, how do we fight this new struggle? Where our adversary, our counterpart, is using tools and brass knuckles in a ring where we're coming in with boxing gloves.
Can I just add one thought to that, which is, I completely agree with Fred. That's the likely scenario. I think our actual attack against a country like Montenegro is very unlikely. But if there were such a thing, I have no doubt that the U.S. and the rest of NATO would all respond. There's no question that in a conventional or clear military attack, there'd be an immediate response. It'd be unthinkable to see anything else.
Well, it would be the end of the NATO alliance, for sure.
Right. And just even in this country, even if there was a person in the administration at a senior level who had a doubt, the Congress, the public opinion, the allies, everybody would be all over it.
Ben?
So I completely agree with this when it comes to NATO. However, there has been a major strategic crisis on which the United States has not been involved in last years, the greatest humanitarian tragedy of the 21st century, that had existential consequences for the European Union. It's Syria. And that leads also to the question of what, beyond great power politics, of how the European Union should think of itself and develop its strategic capacities and maybe its own autonomy, or at least decision-making process on its own. Syria had major consequences when it came to the rise of ISIS and terrorist attacks in all the major European capitals, and the refugee flows. Salvini would not be where he is without Syria. You wouldn't have that rise of populism. It's been literally an existential crisis for Europeans. And their response has been, because of the lack of capacities and strategic thinking, to turn to the United States. And two presidents in a row, for completely understandable reason, considered that their priority was not to get dragged in another Middle East conflict after Iraq. Public opinion was opposed to it, and policymakers considered, it was very heated debate, we considered that it was not a priority for the United States to be there. And so these are moments where I think Europeans, not against the US, but on its own, when it's less of a priority for the United States, and I think it would be actually helpful to US interests if they had proxies or allies who would be able to take leadership on issues like this, should be able to develop their capacities.
Ben's absolutely right there, and I'd stretch that to Africa as well, where I think the interest in the dangers of a refugee flood into Europe is going to make that a greater strategic priority for Europe than others. The one place where I'd say there is a danger is not that we wouldn't react, I agree with Kurt on this, but another party would think we would not, and then would take a risk and miscalculate the potential. And I think when one doesn't signal clearly, there is a danger of miscalculation.
In the back.
Hello, Annie Chikwaza, Voice of America, Georgian Service. My question is about what you just said, Ben, about the European Union, but not about, about its eastern flank in a way, because you talked about Brexit, and with the UK departing, for us, for Georgians, for Ukrainians, this can actually serve as a signal to say that Europe is not only the Brussels, it's actually bigger than that. So Europe is not only European Union, but because UK is living it, we can be outside European Union and be considered Europeans, and this has has symbolic importance. But to your point about strategic autonomy, where does this Eastern neighborhood policy stand there? What's the view? What should be the rethinking of Eastern Partnership and the Eastern neighborhood policy? Thank you.
Well, two things. I mean, first on Brexit, for me, it's going to be really key for Europeans immediately once this is done, and I think it's probably going to happen before the end of the year, to really rebuild a defense and security relationship with the United Kingdom. I mean, you cannot let this relationship collapse. The UK has too much to offer. It's one of the two major military powers on the continent. It's been a key voice on sanctions, on unity on Russian aggression. So it's obvious that you need this. And on the Eastern neighborhood, I think it's really important. This is also obviously a region on which Central and Eastern European nations play an important role too. Beyond just the question of long-term accession and this process, to see how Europeans could invest more right now, more capacities, more diplomatic engagement, more economic cooperation. I mean, Europeans have so many tools and so much leverage, I think, to bring this region closer. And be a little more strategic. I was talking about Ukraine earlier. I mean, I think the free trade agreement was a good idea, but it was not fought in a strategic and political way, and it was seen as a lower priority until the crisis erupted. So I think it's going to be very important for Europeans to get more engaged, and this is where countries like Poland has been on Ukraine as a leading voice. I mean, it's really important for the V4 to lead the way politically there.
Any other questions? Well, I'm sorry, sir.
Well, just kind of a follow-up on that. Ambassador Volker, Keith Gessen, I'm a freelance journalist. Ambassador Volker, you said that the one reason to deny or delay Georgian inclusion into NATO would be the occupied territories, but surely there are other reasons, including Russian objections. So what about Russian objections?
Great. So I think that the big defining thing in this issue is the opportunity for people to choose their own direction. This is something that was enshrined in the Helsinki Accords, the non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, the ability to choose your own security orientation, the no change of borders by force, no threat or use of force. All of those things are long established as part of the doctrine of how Europe is supposed to be secure and then increasingly prosperous and democratic. And it's not for Russia to say what its neighbors can or can't do. It's for those countries themselves to chart their own course. I don't think Russia should have a special role in saying, well, Ukraine can't do this or Georgia can't do that, or if they do, I will take some of their territory. That's something that we just fundamentally have to reject.
I think we have time for one more question. Pavel.
Hi, Pavel Demes, GMF Transatlantic Fellow. I have two questions. One, Britain is leaving soon, and your president said that Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are great guys. Are there others, serious policymakers in this town who would say that these guys are great guys? Particularly since we are talking about Europe whole, free and at peace is overarching theme for this two-day seminar, but it somehow contradicts that. And second question, I'm a bit worried that US diplomacy nowadays is rather silenced and much weaker than we used to have. If Donald Trump is re-elected, do you think he will give more space for diplomacy or he will keep it as it is?
I would love to answer this.
Do you have a political career in your future?
Do I? Not anymore. But if I could answer that, first off on diplomacy, let me start there. I think that I put a lot of concern, expectation, disappointment on our own diplomats, our own foreign service. I understand that you can feel like you don't know what the policy is. I can understand that you feel concerned that if you get out there and then somebody above you changes their mind and you're exposed in there. I can understand you may not like some of the politics that your democratically elected political leadership is choosing. But if you are a diplomat working for the United States, it is your obligation to be creative, be proactive, be making recommendations, take a shot at something. If you get overturned, you get overturned. But your job is to be out there. And I don't see our colleagues willing to take those risks right now. And I think that's a shame. Second, I'd like to come back to Ben's points about Europe, and they connect to your questions about Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. I think something we didn't say, but needs to be said, is that the European Union is obviously a great thing and very beneficial to the United States, but it also went in a direction of ever closer union, greater political integration, and an agenda that was multinationalizing or integrationist that way, and also with a liberal political agenda, which alienated a lot of people across Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Britain. And the elites leading Europe not only failed to respect sufficiently differences in national identity and culture that people clung to very strongly, but when it came to issues like immigration, they didn't act. And so they alienated publics even more. And what you see in somebody like a Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage or Viktor Orban or others in Poland and Salvini is they are connecting with that disenfranchised Europe sentiment within Europe. And I put as much blame on the leaders of Europe who got it wrong as I do on those who are now exploiting this discontent for bad purposes. I think we're going to have to see an evolution towards a Europe that is rigorously integrating economically, but respectful of different national choices when it comes to politics, culture, identity, and so forth.
So Fred and Ben want to make a comment. And if you would, Ben, when you do it, and Fred and Kurt, your final 1 minute.
I'm on the record. I think Brexit's a mistake. I think history will show it as such. I'm not yet 100% convinced it's going to happen. I think things are so volatile in the UK right now. I don't know how politicians cannot take it back for a second referendum. I just don't think it would be fair to the populace. It could be divisive, it could be a fight, but they didn't, now one would know the terms. Before one didn't know the terms. So I don't know how this unfolds. I don't think we've seen the end of the story there. I know it's in US interest, the UK, the European Union, that's for sure. I believe if you look at the economics, if you look at investment, if you look at lost investment, that the UK on balance, but it's their decision. It's going to go. I don't think it's done yet. The Trump administration and foreign policy. If you look at the four big things that I'm watching really closely that are in play, Venezuela to replace a despotic regime with something more democratic would be a good thing. That's in play. Iran's misbehavior regionally, its terrorism, its missile proliferation that the Obama administration didn't touch with JCPOA. I wouldn't have left JCPOA. I would have leveraged it with the Europeans to get, and things were moving in that direction. But we are where we are now. To constrain their misbehavior would be a good thing. Talking to the North Koreans, we've had fewer tests. You know, we don't know where that's going to go. That's not a bad thing. Unfair Chinese trade, we looked the other way forever. We're now standing up to it. Not a bad thing. The problem is, what is the strategy to bring any of those four things? Any one of those four things in an administration would be, enough for, a Nobel Peace Prize. But all four are being juggled at once. And the question for me is there sufficient bandwidth? Is there sufficient skill? Is there sufficient diplomatic support? Is there sufficient strategic concept behind it all to lead that in a great direction. But I try to take, and we try to take the partisanship out of this and take each of these situations on its own and sort of judge how can we move. These are hugely important issues to get right. And taking disruptive point to them is not necessarily a bad thing, and that's what the American people elected. They elected an insurgent. They elected someone who's disruptive, and that's what the American electorate wanted, and so they got it. And now the question is, to me, is that going to work out better than traditional diplomacy, which has failed us quite often as well. So that's since we're ending, I'm just going to end with one anecdote because I really want to share this. I don't think I've ever shared this publicly. So Bronisław Geremek, at that point, he was foreign minister of Poland at the Vilnius 10 conference, and they signed that all these 10 countries were going to come into NATO together, and it was a huge work together. Huge victory, amazing accomplishment. And I was there, and I watched it all happen. And I'd known Geremek for some time from Solidarity Times as a reporter, and we went out for a drink, and he was really depressed. And I said, "What are you talking about? This is victory." And he said, "It should have been the Vilnius 11. We should have. We've lost the chance for Ukraine, and I'm not sure we'll get it back." And it was really interesting that he saw that far ahead, and he saw a moment. And so, yes, Russia doesn't have the right to tell Ukraine what to do, but there's also timing of when we have a window opening, and whether the U.S. and its friends and allies are willing to take it on.
Thanks. We got to be fast. So Kurt, and then Ben for the final minute.
2 points. One, so we didn't talk much about, I just want to reemphasize the importance of countering Russia's narrative about all of this. We had the question about, shouldn't we leave a sphere of influence for Russia, and isn't NATO being aggressive, and NATO lied about moving infrastructure into former Warsaw Pact countries. So it's very important that we take on the Russian narrative, keep explaining what the actual situation is. And a key part of that is, again, related to this question about Russia's sphere of influence, the U.S., whether it's Venezuela or whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Georgia or whether it's Germany, is on the side of people making their own choices. Russia is on the side of imposing its view on other people. And we just have to make it crystal clear that's what's going on. I see this very earnest staffer from the Atlantic Council sitting here. I would like to park you somewhere in eastern Estonia and just say, stop. Just a sign that says stop.
Ben.
Very quick point to follow on what Kurt was saying earlier. I think it's really key. The failure of European leaders to confront this return of identity of sovereignty. There's been an overreach. And there's been a failure in some policies. I mean, if you look at the question of immigration that we mentioned, the deal was you transfer internal borders to external borders. The problem is that for most people, it was just an abandonment of borders because we never put the resources and manpower and the common policy to be able to secure these external borders. And so the question now for Europeans is, are they able to transfer some of these tools of power politics and sovereignty to be able to make the case to their population that the European Union can protect them on trade, can protect them on security, can protect them against unregulated flows of immigration, or do we go back to nation-states national borders? I think Europeans would be much stronger making this case together, but you have to deliver. You have to make it as democratic as you can, but you really have to make the case because, as Kurt said, you need to push back against the Russian narrative, the Russian disinformation that's been pervasive in European polities, but you also have to be very conscious of very legitimate grievances that people have. Russia is exploiting the flaws of our own leaderships, of our own elites. So it's going to find this balance that's key, but we started with the end of history. We are in this return of history, so I think the question is, can Europeans deal with this? And in this respect, once again, Visegrad 4 countries, Central and Eastern European countries have such an important role to play because I think they're much more lucid about this thing than maybe other Europeans.
Gentlemen, thank you. And just, Pavel, I would like to say that when these three gentlemen are active and going for it, there's hope, and this is the influencer in the Atlantic Council, and with GLOBSEC, we can make a difference. So this is what it's all about. So thank you all for coming.